Welcome to The Debate. Our source material today, well, it really places us squarely at the intersection of, let's say, deep personal conviction and the hard demands of evidence. We're exploring the profound personal transformations claimed through spiritual and energy healing, and setting that against the backdrop of pretty stringent scientific scrutiny.
Mm-hmm. And this topic really forces us to confront the difference between someone's deeply felt personal conviction and, well, the clinical reality. We're looking at modalities often grouped under the term energy medicine, which fundamentally rely on channeling energies that are essentially undetectable by our current science. So the central question, the one we can't avoid, is this. Does the undeniably powerful subjective experience, the efficacy people feel, and the transformative stories we hear about spiritual healing, does that justify accepting it as a legitimate path for mental and physical well-being? Especially when there's this persistent, documented lack of a specific, verifiable scientific mechanism behind it all.
Right, and I'll be arguing that the profound, often immediate, and sometimes even spontaneous impact these spiritual and energy practices have on an individual's life. I mean, by fundamentally shifting their conscious state, their emotional frequency, that this confirms their inherent power and validity. We really have to recognize the perhaps limitations of a purely materialist science when it comes to measuring conscious reality.
And I'm going to maintain that subjective experience, no matter how potent or life-changing it feels, simply cannot override the need for solid empirical evidence. The absence of specific non-placebo mechanisms, combined with the fact that these methods are consistently categorized by the scientific community as pseudoscience, well, that renders them scientifically invalid as actual healing modalities. It demands we prioritize patient safety through empirical verification.
Okay, so my position, it's really grounded in this demonstrable shift in consciousness, which then leads to tangible, documented physical changes. We have some pretty startling accounts of individuals who achieve dramatic relief, often where conventional medicine has frankly failed them. I mean, think of a patient suffering from something awful like chronic regional pain syndrome, CRPS, a severely debilitating chronic pain condition who reports immediate relief. They describe as, quote, better than ketamine. Or, we have accounts of severe back pain dropping almost instantaneously from, say, a 7 out of 10 down to a 2. These kinds of instantaneous shifts, they're often described as a form of spontaneous healing, almost an awakening, which seems to demonstrate the potent influence of, well, conscious energy over physical reality.
While I certainly don't dismiss the emotional reality of those testimonies, they are clearly powerful for the individuals involved. We have to be intellectually precise here. Testimonials, however compelling they sound, just don't constitute clinical data. Practices like spiritual healing, they're built upon what scientists would call a pseudoscientific premise. They rely on this concept of putative energy, an energy form that remains physically undetectable by any standard scientific instrumentation we have. The claim that everything is fundamentally energy and vibration. Well, that's a conceptual framework, maybe a metaphysical one, but it's not a scientifically established mechanism. We really have to ask, if the effect is so immediate and profound, why is the specific energy or, wave transmission completely undetectable in a controlled laboratory setting?
Well, I think the framework itself might offer an answer there. The core principle is that our health is intrinsically linked to our emotional and our conscious state. The source material we looked at speaks very explicitly about how a fear-based modern medicine, which often focuses solely on managing symptoms, can actually cripple physical and mental well-being, driving people toward, continued suffering and desperation. Conversely, the idea is that by actively cultivating high-vibration emotions, things like gratitude, love, and aligning our thoughts, maybe through practices like mantra chanting, we activate a kind of power that influences our physical reality, perhaps through something like quantum interconnectedness.
This conscious shift, the argument goes, prevents the body from triggering its own self-destruction mechanisms. Like the source mentions the idea of a cyanide pill hidden in human cells, leading to disease, infection, even cancer. which gets activated by chronic states of fear and negativity.
Okay, that's an interesting attempt to weave physiological concepts like cellular self-destruction with spiritual claims. But the use of language like quantum interconnectedness and vibrational frequencies, that's precisely the kind of thing that leads to the pseudo-scientific classification. This is often referred to as pseudophysics. It's borrowing complex terms from actual science like quantum entanglement, which really only applies rigorously at the subatomic level, and then inappropriately applying it to macro systems like human consciousness to lend a kind of false air of scientific authority. Furthermore, when you look at systematic reviews, rigorous analyses of studies on both distant healing and contact healing for chronic conditions, they consistently show that any reported benefit is indistinguishable from the results you get with simulated healers or, the well-documented psychological effects of placebo. The subjective power of belief is immense, absolutely. But that doesn't equate to a verifiable external energy field causing the healing.
But if we insist that healing must be defined purely by a specific, measurable intervention acting on a distinct physical target, aren't we fundamentally missing the holistic nature of well-being? I mean, if these practices facilitate immediate and genuinely measurable psychological benefits, like achieving better emotional regulation, cognitive clarity, significant stress reduction, feeling a deep inner peace, are those not in themselves profound forms of healing? The source material makes a pretty powerful case, I think, that conventional, often fear-based systems frequently fail to address the deep emotional root causes of suffering. And there are qualitative studies confirming that things like mantra chanting serve as culturally embedded mental health interventions. They demonstrably help people manage anxiety and emotional imbalances.
Regardless of whether you can stick a probe in and verify the existence of some putative energy.
I'd challenge the underlying assumption there. The idea that the subjective transformation must be caused by some kind of external or channeled energy. We really need to pursue conceptual clarity. If the therapeutic effect can be reasonably explained by known powerful psychological mechanisms, things like mindfulness, cognitive reframing, suggestion, or the incredibly robust placebo effect, then doesn't intellectual honesty demand we label these practices accurately? Maybe as psychological support or contemplative practice, rather than specifically energy healing. To take the profound emotional shift you describe, which is real, and then claim it as a cure for physical disease without specific, verifiable evidence for that link, well, that feels misleading and potentially compromises public health discourse.
Are you really arguing we can't call something healing unless it involves, a measurable quantum field? No, I'm arguing that perhaps our current scientific tools are incomplete when dealing with the complexities of consciousness. What do we do with that spark, that moment of undeniable realization or conversion that truly transforms an individual? The material we read describes spiritual conversion, which often mirrors these healing experiences, as occurring beyond the conscious states of mind. It results in this instant certainty, this feeling that it is the truth. One patient even described physical manifestations like feeling a sudden surge of electricity or involuntary muscle twitching during a session. This isn't just quiet contemplation or thinking differently. It feels like a fundamental, often ineffable encounter with some kind of transforming force that immediately shifts their internal frequency away from the fear and negativity that arguably allows disease to thrive.
That is indeed a powerful description of what researchers would likely classify as a mystical experience. But the very nature of mysticism, its ineffability, its passive quality, its subjectivity, is what fundamentally separates it from the domain of testable science. We absolutely respect the personal conviction, the power of that experience for the individual, but we cannot accept a subjective turning point as objective truth about external reality if it's scientifically implausible or, crucially, untestable. We have dedicated significant resources to rigorous clinical trials, even for practices like distant healing. And honestly, the evidence base is, as researchers put it, increasingly negative. And let's not forget, this field is unfortunately riddled with documented risks. It's sometimes tied to the marketing of fraudulent energy medicine devices and the exploitation of scientific illiteracy, promising cures without any real accountability.
But that framing, I think, sidesteps the central point about the potential inadequacy of a purely reductionist paradigm.
The conversion process you're calling purely mystical could be seen as precisely the mechanism by which the individual conquers the deep-seated fear that the source material identifies as perhaps the first and most important factor necessary to prevent illness. When a person manages to transcend that crippling fear of poverty, failure, poor health, they might actually dismantle the internal psychological environment that fosters disease. So we're talking about potentially utilizing spiritual awareness to bypass the anxiety often fostered by fear-based aspects of medicine, and maybe enabling the body's own innate self-healing capabilities. It's about holistic transformation, addressing that root emotional cause that conventional medicine often, overlooks or doesn't have tools for.
Okay, but then we absolutely must address the serious ethical and practical implications that arise from these claims. The source material itself is quite explicit in its warnings. Reliance on spiritual healing alone is associated with serious harm, even death, if patients delay or completely forego necessary conventional medical treatment for things like chronic illnesses or urgent conditions. When an individual, for example, attributes their cancer remission solely to high vibrations and decides to abandon chemotherapy against medical advice, the potential consequences are tragic and utterly avoidable. This is exactly where the lack of verifiability becomes a real public health nightmare. If we can't measure the mechanism or reliably predict the outcome, how can we possibly regulate it responsibly, especially when lives are potentially at stake?
The claims might sound compelling, even comforting, but they are absolutely not a substitute for licensed medical care, and the boundary between complementary support and dangerous replacement therapy gets dangerously blurred by practitioners who promise outright cures.
I agree completely. Replacement of licensed care is dangerous, and patients should always seek qualified medical counsel, no question. But I believe the strength of these practices often lies precisely in their complementary role. The idea is they work alongside traditional medicine by addressing those deep-seated emotional disturbances, past trauma, lack of self-esteem, that according to this energetic framework might create the very conditions for illness to take root in the first place. Spiritual practices, in this view, promote a more robust, overall well-being, potentially strengthening the immune system by helping dissolve dense, negative emotional states. This holistic support could ensure that even if a patient requires something like chemotherapy or surgery, they approach that necessary intervention from a place of greater resilience and hope, maybe having conquered some of the fear that can fundamentally inhibit the body's own healing process.
The fundamental problem remains the potential misrepresentation of the effect. Promoting emotional resilience, hope, stress reduction, that's laudable and clearly beneficial psychological support. Presenting it as a direct treatment for physical disease operating through some channeled energy, especially when science repeatedly refutes that specific mechanism, that's where the danger lies. We simply cannot confuse the very real, very powerful psychological benefits of hope, belief, and contemplative practice with scientifically unfounded claims of specific physical healing efficacy beyond placebo. We have to demand transparency. The field needs to be clear about its classification, perhaps as complementary psychological or spiritual support, rather than masking its lack of specific evidence behind complex, often misused physics terminology.
To summarize my view, the material we've discussed demonstrates that spiritual and energy practices can and often do facilitate genuine, profound psychological, emotional, and sometimes even perceived physical benefits. These seem rooted in an experiential framework centered on energy and consciousness, the subjective certainty people report, the feeling of spontaneous transformation, and the conscious conquering of fear. These can't be rationally dismissed as merely incidental psychological coping mechanisms. They appear to be powerful drivers of authentic personal and sometimes physical change for those individuals.
And from my perspective, the rigorous scientific examination of energy healing when subjected to controlled conditions, consistently fails to demonstrate specific effects beyond known psychological responses, primarily the placebo effect. While we absolutely acknowledge the subjective experience is profound and meaningful to the person, intellectual honesty compels us to classify these methods, especially when they make claims of medical efficacy, as pseudoscientific alternatives. This demands extreme caution to ensure they integrate responsibly as complementary support rather than dangerously replacing evidence-based medical care.
So it's clear the material illustrates this fundamental tension, doesn't it? Between the profound, immediate conviction found in personal experience on one hand, and the strict, verifiable demands of empirical evidence on the other. It really leaves the determination of true efficacy, the true nature of what constitutes healing, somewhat to the individual's interpretation, weighing their own experience against the available scientific data.